Okay, so today we're going to talk about four other 19th century ideologies that are very important for us to understand as we continue to do our trek through the long 19th century. They are Impressionism, Darwinism, Irrationalism, and psychoanalysis. And with each one of these with each one of these ideologies, we're going to have a particular figure that represents that ideology, to which we'll study and look at a little bit more. For next time, just remember that there is no reading and you will have your Unit 2 exam. The Unit 2 exam will be an online exam. It'll be taken digitally through Moodle. And so just stay tuned for a message about that and when you can have access to that. Also, I'm going to give you access to my trivia game that you can watch and review, which will have 25 questions on it that are real questions from the real exam. All right, so let's talk about Impressionism. If you were to characterize Impressionism, you would say that Impressionism began to turn away from the deliberate representational form and experiment with personal interpretations, especially the first glance or impression or external reality. So oftentimes Impressionism doesn't have the painting itself. It's not that it's blurry or anything like that, but it doesn't look as realistic or filled with realism as paintings previously attempted to portray. Impressionism focused itself on nature. Part of this is because it's rooted in Romanticist ideology as well. It would capture the everyday life too. So, the everyday life of people walking through the park or of sailboats. There's a treatment of light and form that is of special emphasis with Impressionism. And then there's this elusiveness of sensory reality, the sense that our senses can deceive us, or that we might not take in everything perfectly as we thought we might. So this is a little bit of a push against the Enlightenment. Some pretty significant examples of Impressionism are Monet, Renoir, Degas, and Monet. And so what we're going to do is we're going to just look at one picture. This is Poppy Fields by Claude Monet, and he painted this in 1873. As you can see, what I was talking about as far as kind of the blurriness of reality, you can't see the distinct qualities of the features of the face of these people. You can't see even the features or the formeliness of their bodies, even of these people that are in the poppy fields. You can vaguely even see that there's somebody, a small face right next to the video frame right here. There's a house in the background, and the form of the house isn't as concrete or distinct, but you know that back there in the background, that is a house. And then you also see the light characteristics that are portrayed here with the sky and the clouds having rich lightness, and then the darkness in the bottom left corner and the darkness of the trees, and then the more lightness with the grass and the meadow. And then there's one particular tree that has an outcropping above it that has more light to it. So you see these different features that are played with Impressionism. This is going to be one of the only artistic forms that we're going to be able to have time to really cover during the 19th century, but it's really important to have a good grasp and idea of what Impressionism is. Then there's also the ideology of Darwinism. When we think about one person that best represents Darwinism, we think of Charles Darwin. The characteristics of Darwinism include adaptation, random variation, mutation, natural selection, speciation, and then a long duration, a long period of time. As you probably are familiar slightly with Darwinism, you know that this is a big part of scientific theory and scientific understanding of our origins. The Origin of Species is one of his major works that he wrote. And the very bottom of the screen it says, "Finally, it may not be a logical deduction, but to my imagination it is far more satisfactory to look at such instincts as the young cuckoo ejecting its foster brothers, ants making slaves, the larvae, or the ichneumonidae feeding within the live bodies of caterpillars, not as specially endowed or created instincts, but as small consequences of one general law leading to the advancement of all organic beings, namely, multiply, vary, let the strongest live and the weakest die." This is a good encapsulation of Darwinian theory through a couple images, the long period of time, the variation, the mutation, the natural instincts that take place. Even this from The Descent of Man, talking about the reality that humanity is descended from apes. He says this about humanity: "We must, however, acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man, with all his noble qualities, with sympathy, which feels for the most debased, with benevolence, which extends not only to other men, but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect, which has penetrated into the movements and constitution of the solar system, with all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin." Essentially, that he is derived from apes. At one level, the theory of evolution conformed nicely with the 19th century's ascendant culture of progress. And so later on, we'll even talk about social Darwinism as a theory as well, how that wraps into this scientific theory of evolution. Charles Darwin was an English naturalist who lived from 1809 to 1882. He was a geologist, and he was also a biologist. His idea of scientific evolution, of the origin of species, comes from his voyage of the Beagle. He marries Emma Wedgwood in 1839, and then in 1859 he publishes The Origin of the Species, and in 1871 The Descent of Man. His major contributions, as we've kind of already covered, is evolution and natural selection and the idea of selective breeding. All right, so let's continue on and let's talk about irrationalism. Irrationalism, when you think about one particular person, you want to think about Frederick Nietzsche. Nietzsche was convinced that the excessive development of reason had led to the enfeeblement of the human species. To him, he brings us back to a primal, visceral humanity that in many ways is rooted in this idea of the instincts. It ties itself almost to scientific evolution in some sort of way, that humanity has this visceral, gut instinct, innate reaction that is very animal-like. And so he follows his appetite and he follows his impulses. It was a very critical theory. It was against progress. He was very critical of human progress and the expectation that humans are going to progress greatly. It was very nihilistic. He was against Christianity, and he was against ordered religion. And it's very characterized by a sense of embracing the chaos and the disorder of the world. Nietzsche discovered meaning in the simple struggle to create new values through the heroic cultivation of long, submerged instincts and unconscious striving, as Frankfurter says on page 634. He was a philosopher, he was a composer, he was a poet, he was a scholar. He was a prolific publisher. In 1872, he published The Birth of Tragedy. In 1882, The Gay Science. In 1883, Thus Spoke Zarathustra. In 1886, Beyond Good and Evil. On the Genealogy of Morality in 1887. In 1880, Twilight of the Idols. And all of these philosophical works are very deeply perceptive and just voluminous in their writings. Of course, his major contribution was irrationalism, his critiques of culture and progress, this emphasis on the primal instinct and his interaction with nihilism. This is one of his most famous quotes that he people refer to when they talk about Nietzsche. It's from The Gay Science, where he says, "How to understand our cheerfulness, the greatest recent event, that God is dead, that the belief in the Christian God has become unbelievable, is already starting to cast its first shadow over Europe. Indeed, at hearing the news that the old God is dead, we philosophers and free spirits feel illuminated by a new dawn. Our heart overflows with gratitude, amazement, foreboding, expectation. Finally, the horizon seems clear again, even if not bright. Finally, our ships may set out again, set out to face any danger. Every daring of the lover of knowledge is allowed again. The sea over sea lies open again. Maybe there has never been such an open sea." As somebody who is a critic of progress, there is both an irony that is here, but yet also a very true statement that people are disenchanted. People do not believe that God exists anymore. And to Nietzsche, though this was a lament of some sort for him, the irony is that humanity is not going to be in any better of a position. He realizes that now, without God, we can get rid of the virtue and vice system, which he talks about this in Beyond Good and Evil. That it's okay for us to just gravitate towards our habits and our instincts and to indulge those appetites. That we don't need virtue, that we don't need vice anymore. He was a strong critic about any sort of a moral law that was to exist. And as a philosopher, he was a critic of all of the modern ideas that we can rationalize through how to live life in some sort of reasonable mannered way. But he understood that there's this real problem of suffering and chaos and disorder that just can't be solved easily and cut and dry. And so we have to just reduce ourselves back to our instinct, innate responses to, and somehow have therapy and survive and get through all of the savage stuff that's around us. That's going to lead us to psychoanalysis, which is what we're going to look at in the next video.